Moment. Today, the thing that I'm going to be talking about, as it says in the description, is the idea of Atlantis. This particular topic has always fascinated me to a certain extent because when I was growing up, there were a lot of different things that people were always saying about Atlantis when the topic comes up, whether it's some city that had some horrible thing happen to it, now it's underwater, or that it is a huge continent outside of past the Pillars of Heracles. If you don't know where that is, that's the that's just outside of the Mediterranean, or that this is actually one of the American continents, whether it's South America or North America. Usually, South America is the one that they use in this particular case when it talks about Atlantis. And there's a lot of different things that people do. It shows up in cartoons a lot, where they show this underwater city where mer people live. There's a DC comic book hero named Aquaman who is supposed to have come from Atlantis. That was the place that he came from. As for the story that they give off in this most recent movie as it relates to Aquaman, I'm not sure if that's how they've always attributed him, but he is supposedly coming from Atlantis, which means, of course, Atlantis is something underwater, and you can only get there through one means or another. Not exactly easy to understand, especially as it comes to what DC Comics has to say about it. I saw an episode of DuckTales where they have this thing about Atlantis where they find it down in the Marianas Trench, which of course is kind of ridiculous considering where it is supposed to be. The Marianas Trench is way out and off the Asian coast, either by China or the Philippines, something like that. Well, a bit out from it because it's near where an island chain is there in the Pacific Ocean. So Atlantis, a lot of these different ideas. I have my own personal view as to what Plato was referring to when he talks about Atlantis. One thing that I really like to point out to people is, okay, we have all of these stories about Atlantis. We have all these people who come up with these comic book ideas, these cartoons. You have a whole bunch of different areas. Trying to think, there's several other cartoons besides the ones I mentioned that also talk about Atlantis, DuckTales or Aquaman or whatever. And one of the things that I've noticed, let's see, is if you look into what it actually says in Plato's writings. So Plato is really the oldest person that we know of who talks about this. Depending on how you feel about what the Odyssey says about a certain civilization there that was encountered by Odysseus. But the basic idea, of course, the original idea was that it had been submerged underwater because of a disaster. Now, according to what Plato says, that this was a mighty kingdom that was outside. It covered most of what they controlled most of what is the continent of Africa right now, and they're just outside the Pillar of Heracles, where they have their kingdom set up. They apparently got into some great war with Athens, of all places. Of course, a lot of the ancient Greek things that we get come out of Athens, and so of course they're obsessed with Athens. And there was a great war with Athens, like 9,000 years before their time. That would be like 11,000 years before today. And this war happens, and the Athenians, of course, win. And then at some point, there is something that causes a huge disaster, and then Atlantis is gone. Then you go to a certain part of, I think the Critias is the one that goes into detail describing what Atlantis is like. The description, of course, is a very large place, a very large country. There's talks about dikes, well, not dikes, but there's like bridges over these waterways and everything. And people have drawn some interesting pictures in the description that Plato gives as it relates to the major city, as it relates to Atlantis. Of course, Atlantis was a huge kingdom. Well, technically, it was a huge kingdom with 10 kings, is what is what Plato says. And so I go and I read these descriptions and everything, and I sit there and I'm thinking, okay, this is where the idea of Atlantis comes from, and they've gone and blown it out into all these things that they're talking about here today. Even some of the things that I've seen on the History Channel where they're supposed to be doing a basic academic research into Atlantis. I'll give them kudos for actually having people tell their own stories rather than saying this is what we believe. But it's really strange, some of the ideas that are coming up, things that Plato said nothing about. My own personal view is that when they're talking about the destruction of Atlantis through natural disasters, either because the gods were angry with them, some other reasons. I think Plato pretty much says the gods kind of destroyed the place. My own personal view is that what was being destroyed was actually the Minoan civilization off the coast of, on one of the Greek islands that is named Santorini. There is a super volcano there where, after the last eruption, which actually happened around 1600 BC, there's kind of like a ring of ocean where there's the islands. There's an island that kind of surrounds it, and there's a huge open ocean area there that goes out to the sea and everything. And there was actually a Minoan culture civilization at that location, Santorini, Thera, which is what the ancient Greeks called it. And 1600 BC or somewhere thereabouts, that mountain of that island blew up and it killed almost everybody there. And of course, that caused a whole bunch of natural disasters all around the Aegean and other areas of the Mediterranean. And if you go there to Santorini, what's left of that old ancient island, that was a super volcano, by the way, the most recent one to erupt that we're aware of. If you go to Santorini and you go to some areas where you see the ancient relics of Greek civilization, you'll notice there are a lot of paintings on the walls and a lot of other things that make it clear this was a great Minoan cultural center. And so it's not difficult to see that this is a huge, horrible disaster that happened here. This is in an area that would be familiar to the Greeks. And this would certainly have a huge cultural shifting sort of effect on things. Some actually believe that it's because of these natural disasters that the Minoan civilization, not only on Santorini, but on Crete itself, came to an end because of the fallout from this volcanic eruption. There, of course, would have been, Santorini is not too far from Crete, and the effects would be so devastating that they were not going to be recovering anytime soon. And then all of a sudden, the Mycenaean Greeks came into the area, and then the Dorians came into the area. And so now what you had was actually Greeks that are dominating that area. And it took a while, but it sounds like it took a while, but eventually Greece Greek is essentially the culture that has been the only thing there since about 1000 BC. So that is my idea about what Atlantis is and what the natural disaster is that brought it to a close. Like I said, there's something similar that's talked about in the Odyssey when Odysseus shows up at this place, and after he leaves, there's a natural disaster that wipes a lot of things out. That's my own viewpoint as it relates. That though, of course, is my own viewpoint as it relates to Atlantis and as it relates to what's talked about in the Odyssey. So what about these other ideas that people have? Where do they get these ideas from? You could say, well, we found these areas and archaeologically this could be what's going on and everything. But what exactly are they looking at? The people who believe that it was outside of the Pillars of Heracles, as Plato says it was. Some say that there was actually a certain continent or a large landmass just outside of the pillars there that got disrupted and blew up, similar to what happened in Thera, and now it's underwater. Some attribute some kind of ice age situation where the civilization died because the water rose and wiped it out. That one I don't really ascribe to. There's not really any decent description in the evidence that I could see. But the other people have interesting ideas. The ones that believe in the South America idea. First, what you have to understand is if the South America idea is true, that means that there has been ocean-going traffic between Europe and the Americas for a long time, and then suddenly it stopped for a long time until it gradually sort of built up again. Could the ancient Greeks really have been interacting with these people that are on the South American continent? The person who is on that History Channel's documentary is showing a lot of things that indicate that, look, there are things here in South America that actually give evidence that there was a much larger population here at one time, and that there might have been a lot of things that were built here, despite what you might realize or think. Many structures, if they are left to sit for like 30,000 years, we have yet to build anything that can sit without maintenance, without overlooking it or whatever, that can just sit there and stay in place for 30,000 years. Even our huge skyscrapers or other buildings we build to last, after a few thousand years of lack of maintenance, it'll eventually rot and crumble, and the weather will do a lot of things to it. Could we possibly find evidence of these kinds of ancient relics or things that could come down to us? If we could dig archaeologically, maybe, but remember the climate in South America is definitely it's really wet and corrosive around most of the things that humans are able to build back then. This particular researcher went and was showing that there are several things that could possibly be seen as artificial canals that people might have used that stretched throughout much of South America. And he was showing that, look, if they could ride boats through these canals, or these things that could be canals, not all of them are connected at the moment, but many of them could look like they could have been at some time. Geologically, of course, things change all the time as time progresses. So he was saying, look, I can take a boat. If I take this boat and set out from this particular location, I can get all the way down. I could start in Peru and I can always head all the way down to Chile. Of course, you have to somehow get around the mountain range that's there. I forget its name off the top of my head. There is a huge mountain range, the Andes Mountains. So how do you get around these Andes Mountains when you're doing all these things? Well, who knows? People are always claiming that the Atlanteans were the most sophisticated and most technologically advanced people in history and blah, blah, blah. And we have yet to catch up with them. As I've said in prior videos, technology can get lost, but I'm not personally going to go along with that until I actually see something else. I am a skeptic when it comes to a lot of things, but I would really like to see if there is actually evidence of this particular this particular bit of evidence, or if there's good evidence of this particular idea being accurate and correct. The Atlanteans were supposedly supposed to be sophisticated and everything. It's like, well, do we have any writings at all? Is there any carvings of any kind? If they were really sophisticated, were they working with metal? Is there any metal remnants of anything that could be found there? I'm just a bit, let's just say, when people keep ascribing everything to Atlantis that sounds technologically advanced, that just really kind of gets to me. I'm like, dude, just see what you can find if there is some kind of evidence, because you're not going to go into Plato's book, Plato's Critias dialogue, Timaeus or Critias dialogue, and have enough information to tell you, okay, this is Atlantis. They have said that there is actually, well, having said that, there is actually a spot in southern Spain, not too far from the coast, which at one time could have been a coastal settlement that might fulfill some of the descriptions they have as it relates to Atlantis. Of course, that would put it in Spain near the Pillars of Heracles. And let's just say if Thera and Crete are not the answer to this particular dilemma, that particular settlement where it shows evidence of circular formations and constructions done a long time ago that are somewhat described in the Critias, then I'll say, okay, let's see if we can find anything there that'll back this up. I seriously doubt you're going to find evidence of something indicating they had machines that flew or television or whatever, but let me see it, and then maybe I'll believe it. But there's been quite a few hoaxes done over time. People want to get their names into the journals and the books, and so they come up with a lot of these elaborate things that are nonsense, most of which do get debunked pretty quickly, but others do take a little bit more time to do that. But all of the different ideas about Atlantis, they can possibly be resolved here with continued research, but I'm skeptical about where you could find any evidence of that unless you find it underwater. But if it's old enough, water is definitely going to have its effect on it as well. So this is what I've got to say on Atlantis. Keep searching and seeing what you can find. Don't expect Plato to give you a whole lot of stuff, except maybe, like I said, that little thing that they found in Spain that partially may fit the description. And I hope everyone's having a wonderful Thursday. I'll talk to you again later. Until next time, I bid thee adieu.